Hello, everyone. I can see people pouring in. We'll just wait a minute until everyone has taken their virtual seats with us today. A very warm welcome to everyone joining us today for what's promising to be a very interesting conversation. I hope you all had a chance to watch the video, the presentation by Leni and Mick and Miriam. Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait 1 minute so everyone can come in and join us. Happy Douglas Week. I will just wait 1 more minute for people to come in and join the conversation. All right, I'll just say a few words of welcome. My name is Dr. Caroline Schroeder. I'm here with Kristen Leary and Sarah McCready. We're part of the organizer team here for Douglas Week 2021. We just want to say welcome to Douglas Week and good morning to New York. Good morning to both in the US today, right, Leni and Miriam? And good evening to Mick, who's joining us from Bangkok tonight. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon in Ireland and the rest of Europe. So thank you for joining us. We're delighted to celebrate Frederick Douglass with you. It's been an incredible week, so inspirational. We've seen so many amazing talks, so much inspiration and motivation and so many insights that I'm just in awe. And I know that this conversation will also be one of those events because as a scholar of film and visual arts myself, I'm of course a little bit biased, but I watched the video and it was incredible. So before we start, I just want to say 1 or 2 things of housekeeping. So one is that there's a Q&A box, so you can pop your questions in there in the Q&A box. Kristen, Sarah, myself will be in the background. We'll be monitoring the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll pass it on to the speakers. So feel free, be curious, feel free to pop in your questions. And also this session is being recorded. So hello to everyone on YouTube, and this recording will also be available then on our YouTube channel later on. If you have any questions, pop them in the question and answer box, and I will now hand over to the wonderful Miriam Nyhan Gray, Dr. Miriam Nyhan Gray from the Glucksman Ireland House at New York University. Miriam, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Leni, Mick, it's an honor, and Miriam, I will hand over to you now. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you to all the organizers again for such a fabulous lineup at a time when the programming and interventions have been such a welcome source of distraction and intellectual engagement around a really important individual who happily for us, spans the Atlantic in a very instructive way. For those of you who, the last time I checked, about 50 people, Leni and Mick, had tuned in to the recording from yesterday. But I think by way of introduction, for those of you who didn't do your homework and haven't already listened, and if you have an opportunity before, I'm not sure how long the presentation will be published on YouTube. So if you haven't seen it and you're inspired to watch it after this conversation, please do so promptly. Perhaps, Leni, may I hand over to you in terms of the framing that you laid out as a kind of backdrop to the notions of representation around surrounding people of African descent, of course, African Americans in particular, and when they came into kind of the constellation of Irishness in the United States and Ireland. Can you kind of frame it out a little bit?
Yes, I will do that. And I'll ask if you'll unmute Mick's mic. Unmute Mick's mic, alliteration today also. So the piece that you viewed or didn't view, depending upon your time and opportunity, was divided into 3 parts. Looking at Frederick Douglass's life from the time he emerges from enslavement to the time of his death, we divided our presentation into 3 parts. looking not only at Douglas as the foreground, but the development of African-American imagery in the United States and in Ireland, not as a background, but as a landscape through which Douglas had to navigate and negotiate. We looked at his emergence in 1838 from enslavement through his masquerade as a sailor. And we looked also at the time that he emerged as the emergence of the Ethiopian delineators. We began with Thomas Dartmouth Rice. And Mick, will you just recap who Thomas Dartmouth Rice was?
Well, he was, as you said, an Ethiopian delineator, but he was basically a one-man variety act who happened to discover that that blacking up was appealing to audiences, and in a sense, he's the man who invented the term Jim Crow through that dance he did in Cincinnati back in 1838, which was, depending on your point of view, either a misrepresentation or an appropriation of black culture, plantation culture. And he started off, I suppose, the craze that eventually became known formally as minstrelsy when the Virginia Minstrels were formed with 3 Irish Americans on the Bowery in New York in 1843.
And Jim Crow's dance was authentic and emerged from Africa, but his mimicry was appropriation and assimilation. He took that onto the stage, the song Wheel About and Turn About and Jump Just So. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. And we know that Jim Crow has become a vicious political term and a paradigm which has locked African Americans into subordination. We then transitioned to the time of Douglas's transformation, the time when he met Emerson and Thoreau, and he was asked to join the Transcendentalists. He began to learn elocution and presentation and the construction of his ideas. It was also the time of the transformation from Ethiopian delineation, which attempted to be accurate about Black culture, to minstrels. And we focused particularly on the minstrels of George Christie and the Christie Minstrels, who came to the stage on the eve of Douglas's departure for Ireland. Would you speak, Mick, briefly about the Christie Minstrels and their importance?
Well, the Christie Minstrels, they were, I suppose, a more sophisticated version of the Virginia Minstrels, purporting to be at least more civilized. And you know, Christie is an Irish American, of course. He's also a music publisher, a very wealthy man, very famous man in his time. And he's the man who, if you're going to talk about appropriation, who appropriated some of Stephen Foster's most famous songs. You know, Leni, struck me that in this presentation, we never got around to things we normally talk about, like the transition from Happy Sambo, you know, the passive, acquiescent African American on stage, to the transition from that to Zip Coon, the dangerous knife-wielding hipster in post-minstrel depictions. Nor did we get around to the desexualized Black Mama and the similarities to the Bridget the Domestic later on in Irish American life. A lot of things we skirted around. We didn't have time.
Well, we were looking at the landscape of imagery and identity that Douglas was negotiating at the time that he found out that there was a bounty on his head. And so he set out for England and Ireland. Now, Mick, the Christie Minstrels beat him there. And so Ireland had a perception and a stereotype of Blacks embedded in their vision and their assumptions because Christie had arrived before Douglas. And would you speak quickly about that?
Well, I think you're probably more knowledgeable about that than I would be, Leni. And I would ask you a question that I forgot to ask you is when we look at Brian's Minstrels, which is the minstrel troupe that Dan Emmett, who's the father of minstrelsy in many ways, that he was in when he wrote Dixie in 1859 on a wet day in New York City, and how he would have fitted into the picture, and how Frederick Douglass, we never got around to this, would have viewed any differences between, say, the Virginia minstrels, the Christie minstrels, and say the Bryant's minstrels. Would he have viewed them as insignificant, or would he have seen a difference like you do?
That's a very good question, Mick, because the Virginia minstrels represent the enslaved in rags, and enslaved men and women only receive 2 sets of clothes a year. One set in the winter and one set in the summer. And so those clothes would have been, they were not wearing rags because they wanted to. They were wearing rags because you worked, you slept, and you had whatever measure of relaxation in the same clothes. The Virginia minstrels are dressed as zipcoon, as freemen and dandies, and urbanites, free blacks. And the Bryan minstrels took up the speeches of the transcendentalists in general, and people like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass in particular. And they were popular for what was known as stump speeches, taking the speeches of important men and transforming them into malaprop. So the middle of our presentation is really about that time when Frederick Douglass sets sail for England and Ireland and has his incredible transformation when he meets Daniel O'Connell, and when he also returns home with his freedom papers. He leaves enslaved, and with a bounty on his head, he returns a free man. The last part of our presentation is, what did he do with that freedom? How did he experience that transformation? And what was happening to the images and stereotypes of African Americans by Irish men in blackface? And I need to say very quickly that the brilliant Peter Quinn, who wrote Banished Children of Eve, has a passage in his book which says that a Paddy in America could elevate himself by becoming a black man. That a Paddy could overcome suppression and oppression by taking on blackface in the minstrel shows, and that it was his black makeup. He was quoting Dan Emmett. His black makeup is what advanced him at the same time that he took on the role of deconstructing the image of black men. And so we ended at that period of 1876 to 1896, and we focused on a company called Harrigan and Hart. And Mick, would you speak about Harrigan and Hart?
Well, Harrigan and Hart, 2 Irish Americans. Ned Harrigan was born in 1844, just very close to what we call the Lower East Side now in New York. It was called Corlier's Hook then, Leni, and as you know, that little particular neighborhood doesn't exist anymore, but it's close to where, anybody who knows New York, close to where the Williamsburg Bridge touches Manhattan. And Anthony Cannon was born in Clare Island in County Mayo, and came in very young to Worcester, Massachusetts with his parents as immigrants, one-way immigrants. As you know, 95% of the Irish immigrants from there to the end of the century didn't go home. They were on a one-way trip. And Anthony Cannon met Ned Harrigan in Chicago. They were both members of minstrel groups, and at the time, Ned Harrigan was in Campbell's Minstrels, and Anthony Cannon was in a group called Madame Rence's minstrels from, I think, Providence, Rhode Island. They were all transsexuals, African American. They were basically transsexuals, posing as African American transsexuals. I would love to have seen that show. But Harrigan meets Cannon on a shoeshine stand in Chicago, according to the story, and they hit it off and decided that minstrelsy was too limited a format, and this was in the late 60s, and that it was too restrictive. So Cannon changes his name to Hart, and Harrigan and Hart became the people who were basically the inventors of musical theatre, musical comedy, musical review, call it what you want. And they did that in New York, representing a variety of different ethnic stereotypes in a series called The Mulligan Garden. That's probably too long an answer, Leni.
No, but that's perfect, Miriam. So 3 Irishmen, or 4 to be exact, with Harrigan and Hart, Scots Irishmen who precede the famine, and famine Irishmen come to America, discover the minstrel format, take it to the stage, become famous, elevate themselves in the status of Americans by portraying Black men, and then export those images to Ireland before, during, and after Frederick Douglass's time. And these are the stereotypes and the iconic images that Frederick Douglass has to navigate, resist, and overcome during his romance, his relationship, and his amalgamation with Ireland and Irish repeal.
Leni, I have one question for you here, which I asked briefly, I suppose, in our presentation, which was, as usual, just kind of the highlights of Leni and myself have been having conversations for 25 years, and they stretch out ad infinitum, and they're rarely the same conversation. But I was going to ask you, would Frederick Douglass have been aware of all the different distinctions? This was not a monolithic creation. There were many different strands and threads. Would they have all been just irrelevant to him?
Oh, no, they were quite relevant to him. And he writes, I would not say eloquently, Miriam, I would say bitterly. He writes bitterly about all 3 schools of thought. As he emerges from enslavement, he is trying to cast off the malaprop and the derogatory, a barefoot, raggedy Southerner. So the Virginia minstrel's popularity is smothering and eclipsing the image that he's trying to become. As he meets Thoreau and Emerson in America, and then O'Connell in York, he is trying to become an elegant gentleman. And so he now has to face Christie and Zip Coon and the kind of images that belittle the freeman as always spending his money at parties, always carrying his razor, and so he writes again about Black men resisting that image. This is a period of riots. This is a period where the Abolitionist Hall in Philadelphia is burned down 48 hours after it is opened. This is a period of the beginning, the arc towards the Fugitive Slave Act. So the notion of the urban Black as a runaway, as a fugitive, is taken up on the minstrel stage. I spoke while we were waiting to come on about the minstrel show being like Saturday Night Live is in America, that every story on the front page or in the news was taken up immediately the next day in blackface and set on. So Frederick Douglass, Mick, really, as he was leaving for Ireland, and especially in his transformation in Ireland, when he feels for the first time like a free man, and in fact, he comes home as a free man, he has to return. By the time he returns, we are now edging towards the Civil War, towards Reconstruction, and the discussion of the Black soldier, which Harrigan and Hart took up in their Mulligan Guards, the New York Irish draft riots. Frederick Douglass would have observed and responded to the deconstruction of images while Black men around him, but he was also being challenged by Miriam, by other African American abolitionists and political ideologies. So now he not only had to fight the minstrels and the white population, but he had to fence literally with other Black ideologies. And so the work that was being done by Harrigan and Hart and in what we refer to as the Kunsthaus would have been, that's why our last section was about resistance, Miriam. You know, he had to resist the images without, and he had to resist the cacophony of opinions from within the Black political community. So yes, he would have had a great deal to say. And I think out in there, because that brings those who did not see the presentation, although we presented an abundance of images for each of those periods, and we talked about those Irish men, and particularly, Miriam, the fact that not only did they come to America and ascend through the paradigm of blackface, but then they returned to Ireland. You know, Irishmen going back home, you know, and inculcating Ireland with an identity through music, through dance, through posters and pictures and playbills, so that even before Frederick Douglass could assume the dignity at the Lyceum and the pedestal, he was consumed by this plethora of stereotype images. And I think that's a base coat for those of you who missed it, and hopefully a Cliff Notes. I'm aging myself there. Yeah, yeah. Side notes for those of you who did.
Well, we have some great questions in, Leni and Mick, and maybe I'll just ask you to, the first one here is, can you talk a little bit about the origin of the term Ethiopian delineator?
Mick, do you want to?
No, you go ahead. You know, the funny thing is this. It's a funny story, Leni, I've never told you. I was waitlisted at a flight to Bozeman, Montana last year, and it didn't look like I'd get on the list at all, and that I'd have to fly to Chicago and then to another town in Montana to get to Butte eventually. It would be about a 17-hour journey, as distinct from going to Bozeman, Montana, from Dallas, which is only about 3 hours. And I arrived at the airport. I stayed overnight. I arrived at the airport, and there was, I thought, an African-American gentleman, the only man checking in for American Airlines at the time. And I said, "What are the chances of getting on board?" He said, "Not very good." And I said, I don't get your accent." I said, I haven't heard your accent, your kind of accent before." He said, "I'm from Ethiopia," he says. And into my head came the Jimmy Driftwood song, "Dad's there sitting, playing in the corner, picking and the grinning like an Ethiopian." He got me to the top of the list right away. So, and that is a Jimmy Driftwood kind of a copy of a minstrel song. But you know where the term Ethiopian delineator is any better than I do.
So let me first talk about the Ethiopian. The Ethiopian is not literally from a geographical or national theme, Miriam. The Ethiopian is a myth, you know, of a magical person, the genie in the bottle, Svarta Pecha, who pulls St. Nicholas's sleigh, Othello, the Prince of Morocco in the Merchant of Venice, who courts Portia and says, "Mislike me not for my complexion." You know, so into American culture and English culture comes this notion of this Black man. The Ethiopians were the guardsmen at the doors. If you look at pictures of Louis' court, you always see Ethiopians in their pantaloons and turbans standing at, you know, genie in the bottle stuff. So this romantic notion comes into England and America and Canada about a Black man who is spiritual and magical. And into the enslavement of the South comes these Irishmen who are approaching the American stage by studying Black men, their dance, their dialect, their gestures, stance, and attitudes, and blacking their faces, first total black, not the mimic mask that the minstrels deconstructed, but trying to portray as best they can the dialect of the Black man in Southern culture. Now, Harvard did a great study called Ebonics. And in Harvard's study of Ebonics, they contest that since the first enslavers were the Dutch, the first language that Black men learned when they assimilated America was Dutch. So the word for this in Dutch is dis. And the word for that in Dutch is dat. And the word for them in Dutch is dem. And the word for those in Dutch is those. Oh, them golden slippers. You know, it's in that and them and those. You know, and because Dutch reverse the to be, the Dutch would say, he be always doing that. Now, doesn't that sound like deep neighborhoods? Why? How come you do that, man? You know? And so the delineators were hearing first Africans in America speaking the assimilated languages and taking them on to the stage. Delineation meant actually copying and reframing for the stage. But we know that the stage is a place of entertainment. When Thomas Dartmouth Rice, Jim Crow, saw an old Black man who was crippled doing the Jim Crow, and we said this, Mick, on the tape, he copied the dance, which was outlawed, from a man who was crippled, then took it on the stage and exaggerated, but he sang it to an English air verse with an African chorus. And Stephen Foster, who we believe is a delineator, captures this in Camptown Races, Oh Do Die Day. Wanna run all night, you know, wanna run all day. Yeah, and so the Ethiopian delineators, that was a long answer, but I'm sorry. The Ethiopian delineators tried as best they could to copy, reconstruct, frame, and represent African and African America on the minstrel stage. The minstrels would be different. Their purpose was political and social satire. They would deconstruct that image, deconstruct those clothes, deconstruct that face, you know, and reconstruct it as a political equation to speak about the challenge of working class people for land, jobs, and status. So.
Thank you, Leni. Next question is also wondering about other symbols to show that minstrel actors were Irish. Excuse me. You mentioned one symbol in the presentation, wondering if there are others. How would people know about these symbols?
Oh, that's a great question. And that person watched and saw the little clay pipe in T.D. Rice's hat. Well, you know, the Brownlee minstrels and the Bryan minstrels, Mick, were in Kansas, and they were so convincing that the town thought they were actually Black men, and so they burned the theater down. And so they developed, instead of blocking their faces completely, Miriam, as the Ethiopian delineators did, they would do the circle mask, leaving their neck and their ears white to expose to the audience, or they would make the fingers off their gloves so their white fingers would stick out. But they also, Miriam, constructed jokes. One of their favorite jokes was they would, Tambo would ask Mr. Bones, Mr. Bones, how is a minstrel like a young widow? And Mr. Bones will say, well, neither are in black for very long. Yeah. And the audience would roar and laugh, but the signal would be passed, you know.
You know, it occurs to me, Leni, that one group that didn't have to signal anything was, in fact, quite the opposite, was the Harrigan and Hart troupe when they played the Mulligan Guards. And that was a series that ran for nearly 2 decades, where the Mulligan Guards were accompanied on stage by the Skidmore Guards, basically the same company. And they had to actually accentuate the differences because the audience knew who they were. And when they put on the burn cork, and that eventually was to do a lot of them in terms of skin damage, that they had to do the opposite. They had to signal opposite, that they weren't Irish Americans. So they were more minstrels than Ethiopian delineators in that context.
Yes, and in the transition from Ethiopian delineation to minstrels, Mick, you know this very well, the Ethiopian delineators called themselves authentic. The Virginia minstrels called themselves genuine. The Christie minstrels called themselves authentic, and the Brownlee minstrels called themselves original. And the audience didn't know if the originals were authentic or the authentics were genuine or which ones were black, you know. And then when the black men came on to the minstrel stage and they had to wear black face makeup, they referred to themselves as Georgia minstrels, which let you know that they were actually black men playing Irishmen in blackface. So audiences, particularly rural audiences, could really get confused, and that confusion could be dangerous.
And we pointed out, I think, more than I, Leni, that none of the Virginia minstrels, the original minstrel troupe, none of them were from Virginia at all, but it sounded authentic.
Yes.
And it
so
makes
the genuines and the authentics and the originals and the Georgias were all out there in the audience. The further you got away from an urban city, the more dangerous it got for you.
Someone asked, were there? I don't think this. Maybe there were examples that you talk mostly about male performers, but were there any females in these spaces?
All of the roles were played by men.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
And some of these men, like George Washington Dixon, who was Zip Coon, but also George Christie, who performed the ballets of he caricatured the ballets of Fanny Ellsler and Lotta Crabtree, the Spanish dances of Lola Montez, and of course we know that Lola Montez was actually an Irish woman. So, you know, here you have an Irish man playing a black man, playing a Spanish woman who is really Irish. You know, like we're not talking about delineation anymore here.
But there were women in the wings of minstrelsy, and you mentioned Lola Montez as Isa Gilbert, but also Lotta Crabtree, Leni, who often put on the cork. And she was the first banjo-playing woman, very diminutive in stature. She became a multimillionaire, traveling with her mother most of the time across America, as you know. And from your years in San Francisco, you'll know that she was a disciple of Lola Montez. So there were people on the fringes of minstrelsy, but also, I think, Leni, sometimes in our presentations, you talk a lot about the yellow girls or the octoroons. and they were represented by men who could easily become effeminate looking because of maybe their physical stature or makeup. Tony Hart, for instance, a lot of people lost money betting that that was a real woman, and the higher the stakes, the bigger the chances, and he was in the act, that they would come backstage whereupon he would demonstrate most graphically that he was not.
And George Haverly of Haverly's Minstrels, a large company called Mastodon Minstrels, had Francis Leon, who only portrayed women, and they would have what was called an olio in the middle of the show, which was basically a fashion show. He would wear these incredible clothes, and women would come, especially in rural towns, to see him and then follow his fashion. Later, at about the time that Frederick Douglass dies, Egbert Austin Williams, Bert Williams, brings his incredible Williams and Walker Company to New York. Bert Williams was the highest paid actor in the Ziegfeld Follies. He made $6,500 a week playing in the Ziegfeld Follies, but he could not have a dressing room in the building because he was Black. So a Black man wearing blackface performing. But his company had Ida Overton Walker, Mick, George Walker's wife. They were a cakewalk team. And after George Walker died, she would wear Black makeup and she would appear as a man. And she would continue George Walker's act on the stage well into 1920. But those minstrels were replaced by dance hall girls, you know, and the great grandmothers of the Rockettes replaced those shows, and what the minstrels referred to as girly shows came into popularity. They were replaced by it.
Can I ask to bring us back to Douglas? What is your sense, Mick and Leni, as to how much on the ground in reality for ordinary Irish men and women who might have gathered to hear Douglas speak? You know, in terms of, you know, the infrastructure in a country that was, you know, very rural and in a certain economic state. I mean, even if it wasn't apparent yet, with regard to the demographic catastrophe that was about to unfold. I'm just wondering how deeply these images, can we assume they would have penetrated into the psyche or understandings of ordinary men and women in 1845 and early 1846 Ireland? Do you know what I mean? A lot of what we're talking about were, you know, looking at urban centers in the United States where these things are really going to become, arguably some of the entertainment industry today, you know, owes its history back to this period. But in terms of on the ground, do you know what I'm trying to get at?
I do know what you're
I do, Miriam. And I personally wouldn't know. I'm not a historian of Ireland at that time, and I wouldn't know. I think you probably know as much as I would about it. Leni, do you have any opinion on that?
Well, again, because Christie goes to Ireland in 1843. So even before, Christie was brilliant about advertising. So playbills, placards on the side of buildings, posters in windows of smiling, dancing coons, emerge, gifts that he would pass out at the train station, ties, bows, spoons, labels on packages, rice boxes, coffee cans, toothpaste tubes, the proliferation of the images and the caricatures of the minstrel show wound up in people's closets
Yeah,
on their kitchen shelves.
I take that point in an American urban context, but what I'm trying to get at is a lot of those items that those commodities you list were not even fathomable to many regular Irish people. Where did Christy go to? I'm just trying to, you know what?
Yes, and yet, Miriam, because the minstrels, slow down, because the minstrels visited Ireland every year until 1896, but especially during the period of 1842 to 1860, they permeated so many images and caricatures of Black men when Irish had never seen any other image of Black men except those, that those famine Irish arrived in America already with stereotype impact about Black people. They came down the ramps, with an image. In fact, Douglas was abused. I mean, we love to talk about his meeting with O'Connell and all that, but there were many Irishmen who thought that he was a pompous rooster. There were many people who were totally offended by how uppity he was. A Black man strutting around in a tailcoat and an embroidered waistcoat and a gold watch, reminded them of the lords and the barons, who they despised. He was an affectation to them.
So to get back to your question, Miriam, I'm thinking as I'm thinking, and the banjo in a sense becomes the enduring symbol of an instrument that enters Irish musical life and remains marginal, played mostly by travelers who are on the edge of society, as we all know. Right until the 1960s, when I took it up, it was still on the edge of the musical culture. So it symbolizes marginality in a sense. And the minstrels would always have played in urban centres, Leni, because you needed an audience. Cork, right. The Virginia minstrels went to Cork, and they went to Dublin, they went to Belfast. That was the formal introduction of the banjo. But as you say, there was a minstrel troupe of one kind or another that came to Ireland every year thereafter and reinforced that image. I suppose, Miriam, it comes down to how much of a connection there was between the urban and rural populations at that time. Transport, as you know, was fairly primitive. And to this, the funny thing is I learned a lot of my music from Michael Russell and most in Doolin and West Clare. And even in his lifetime, most of the people never traveled more than 20 miles in their whole life. That was as far as you could go and still be back and able to do a day's work the next day. So that's why you had these profoundly regional musical traditions in Irish music right up to my lifetime. And we would have to theorize that there was, at the same time, this interpenetration between urban and rural populations, because there always has been. I'd say it was fitful, sporadic, but certainly the banjo becomes the enduring symbol of marginality.
Mick, I need to ask you if you would go back, for those who didn't see the production yesterday, and talk about the diaspora of the banjo.
Well, it's West Africa as an idea carried to the Caribbean and the southern plantations, represented there in a kind of a representation of that idea through the gourd banjo. The origins of the banjo are either vegetable gourd or a very primitive hoop with a neck attached on which was strung animal gut or horsehair, played percussively with the fingers to either accompany music or dancing, sometimes just as instrumental pieces on their own. And that gets appropriated in the sense of the appropriation with the big A and the small a by the Ethiopian delineators, people like Joel Walker Sweeney, whom we didn't get around to. And we know from lithographs of plantation life that the fifth string, the chanterelle, which gives the percussive backbeat of American music, that was present in the plantation long before appropriation. So it's a very complex tale, and we're still working it out. My favorite title for a book on the banjo is Karen Lynn's book, The Half Barbaric Twang.
Yes.
Wow,
But Miriam, you know, Mick and I have been colleagues for 30 years and traveling for 25 years, trying to answer your question. Why do rural Irishmen of the famine come down the ramp to America, completely constructed image of Black men, you know, and a disposition to despise, you know, where did that form? Well, some of the letters and writings of Frederick Douglass speak not only of how well he was received, but how Irish communities, particularly in Belfast and places like that, saw him as a pompous, strutting symbol of the aristocracy that they despised so much. So what part of that reaction was seeing a Black man act like a white man? And what part of that was seeing white men act like a Black man when the minstrels came? It's a very confusing
and when it happened, Leni, because I I would push back on the contention that they brought it with them off the boat. I don't think that I think there's more going on there in terms of learned behavior on site for most of the Irish living in that period, who are socialized and culturalized within such a small radius themselves locally in Ireland. I think there's more going on there. But I want to.
Well, I'm gonna push back on your pushback.
Yeah, do.
Ask Mick to tell a story about a gentleman that he brought to, I believe, Chicago. Mick.
Yeah, it was in 1976, and it's a dancer whose name I will not mention, nor will I mention the county, because he's passed away, and I don't want to. I just choose rather not to. But I was a group that under the aegis of the Smithsonian Institution, I brought around America, and the group that formed out of that, which I still am a member of, the Green Fields of America, came out of that. And this particular individual was in Chicago for 2 hours. And I said to him, what do you think of the city? And he said he'd never been to America or Chicago before. It would be fine if it weren't for it. And then he used the N-word.
Yes, and he had never seen a Black man, but he came with an image and an assumption fully intact. You know, in 2 hours, he made a decision. And so I'm not sure that, well, you know, the saying, a lie travels faster than the truth, you know? So the immersion of the lie about the identity of a people, you know, forms through song, through dance, through joke, you know.
You know what I would factor into it, Miriam, sorry to interrupt, Leni. I would factor in letters. You know that the Out of Ireland film that I was involved in, you know, so long ago, 1994, was built entirely with Kirby Miller as his Immigrants and Exiles book, practically entirely on immigrant letters. And I think it's something we're leaving out of the picture is the power of the letter.
Right.
As a communication and whatever ideas were expressed in those letters. And that would have penetrated all of Ireland from just about all of urban America.
So Miriam, the work that Mick and I have done for these 30 years is really not trying to figure out where the conflicts are, but where the commonalities are.
Oh, no, I know that.
And where the neutral ground is, where the coming together and the sharing and the cultural assimilation in the best term.
Yeah. No, absolutely. No. I you know, I love going forward and back with you on this stuff. Can I ask you? There's a great question in here about interplay, common purpose competition in terms of the minstrelsy, the minstrel kind of sphere. And then like the abolitionist singers or these groups like the Hutchinson family who traveled to Ireland, are they coexisting in very different spheres? I hope I'm kind of paraphrasing that question well, or if that makes sense.
Well, I'd like to ask Mick if he'll talk about Juba and Diamond.
Well, I would be glad to, but I think Leni, Miriam is asking really more about people like the Hutchinson family, and you gave a great presentation in the Irish Arts Centre based on Pittsburgh and Stephen Foster and the abolitionist movements, and I don't remember the details except I was there as usual, spellbound. And you're better equipped to deal with this, the answer, I think, than I am in this case.
You're very generous, Mick. You're very generous. In that conversation, we were talking about Stephen Foster, who was from Allegheny City, which is just across the river from Pittsburgh, and how Stephen Foster's father was running for mayor of Allegheny City. And so he hired a Black band to play at his rally. And the nativist Irish community attacked Foster, his father, the musicians, the campaign people. They had to create a human wall to get Frank Kelly, who is always, Mick, I think it's interesting that this Black band leader took on an Irish name. You know, everybody took on an Irish name. I mean, that was the way you were supposed to do it if you wanted to. But there was the conflict of loving the music and hating the musician. And we talk a lot about how at the same time that Douglas was in Ireland, Henrietta Greenwald, an opera singer who was called the Black Swan, was in Ireland singing and having a great success in concert work. As a matter of fact, Douglas, that was one of the positive images that he leaned to. Also, Ira Aldridge was there. Ira Aldridge from the Great African Grove Theater in New York, a Shakespearean, was doing Richard III in Ireland while Douglas was there. So even though there were these minstrel images, there were also these positive, what I refer to as Northern Lights. Of course, we know that he spoke, or maybe you don't know, I should not be so presumptuous, that Douglas had observed a funeral in Ireland and was so amazed by the Keeners because their wailing sounded like the women in the Georgia and Alabama plantations. And he made all these connections between the Irish wake and the New Orleans funeral. Mick and I did a series of concerts at Symphony Space in New York City, where we were comparing the Irish straw boy to the Caribbean Junkanoo, and how the character, the dance, the ritual, the purpose of coming out on solstice night and New Year's Day were the same. And we actually had straw boys and Junkanoos. You know,
or as we use the term, the demons of disorder.
The demons of disorder came out, you know. But how come you can put this picture of the Caribbean Junkanoo and the Irish straw boys next to each other, and it is impossible to tell, you know.
You know, Leni, what we've left out of the picture a little bit is that, and I would use Eric Lott's enduring phrase, or the title of one of his essays became a book, Love and Theft.
Right.
The idealization and the image of the Black man, the Black woman as the embodiment of the original, the pure, the undistilled, and at the same time the fury and the thievery. And it's all mixed up in a kind of a jumbled set of motives.
And when you put these two people outside of normal culture, outside of normal society, would you reject them to the edges of the workplace? You know, as in a great book that Mick has introduced me to, and I read it and reread it, it's called Singing the Master. And it's about work songs and play songs and lamentations. And Douglas speaks a lot about the music of Ireland and the music of the South in its work and play and lamentation.
Yes, and the cultures coming together at moments of dual collaborative labor, like corn shucking, which I didn't know anything about corn shucking when I left County Limerick, but when I arrived in Alabama, I had to learn.
Or driving rails, or picks in coal mines. Do you have time for other questions, Miriam? We've been.
Yeah, no, I think that much and all, you know how much I enjoy this, but we're nearly on the hour now. And just to be fair to people in terms of other programs on later in the day, I can't remember exactly, excuse me, what's on next. To be continued.
Absolutely.
I always learn so much. I've heard you a few times, both of you. Leni, you and I speak frequently. I never come away from a conversation without learning more than I can imagine. Thank you for your wonderful presentation yesterday, and thank you for today. And please keep doing what you're doing. You know, we'll make sure to publicize venues and share opportunities to continue these conversations, because they're so important in terms of us trying to, I hope somehow get some understanding, perhaps, or inform some of the understandings we have of the world we are experiencing today. And I make that comment with implicit reference to what's going on in US politics actually at the moment while we're even airing. So
well, Miriam, I will apologize to all those who had questions that didn't get answered.
Yeah.
With my apology includes the fact that Mick and I are mesmerized by each other. So like once we get even in virtual presence with each other, we often forget about the audience and get got into.
Yeah, we got through proportionately about 50%, Leni, of them. So I think that we're doing, I don't feel too guilty. And Mick and Leni are, kind of available for follow-up, I think, if you can reach out to them after. There were one or two things I wanted to say before I wrap up. Oh, I wanted to give a shameless plug. On Thursday, I'm interviewing Reverend Herbert Daughtry, who was part of a delegation of 5 African-American activists who traveled to Belfast in the aftermath of the hunger strikes in late 1981. It culminated in a film called The Black and the Green, which we hope to screen in the fall. But Reverend Daughtry, he's 90 and he's a force of nature, and he got such a kick out of the fact he didn't know, he's a very learned man, but he didn't know about Douglas's trip to Ireland, and he didn't know that Douglas had been in Belfast, where he would be so many decades later. So please do join us on Thursday through Luxman Ireland House if you'd like to learn something about the 20th century experience of a civil rights activist traveling into Irish spaces, and how he has how he reflects on that, on this moment of his life. I want to thank you for asking me to moderate today. I didn't have to do very much, as you can see with Leni and Mick. They could carry the show on their own, which they often do. And thanks again, Leni and Mick, for your generosity of time and spirit and contributing. I know we're all on the same page in terms of seizing opportunities to contribute to these very, very important dialogues, not just about the past, but how they're informing our present, because these conversations are more important than ever, not only in American spaces and in Irish spaces in America, but indeed in Ireland itself. So I'll hand back over to the Douglas Week team, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Miriam, and thanks so much to you, Leni and Mick. I think the fact that we only reached 50% of the questions indicates the level of interest in the subject matter and in your dialogue between each other. So we really appreciate all of you spending some time with us here. And please spend more time with us. We do have a day and a half left of Douglas Week. We're in Douglas Weekend. We've got some great programs still to come this afternoon. Also tomorrow during the afternoon, GMT will close out tomorrow night at 8 p.m. GMT with a great panel of impressive and inspiring women. All of the information about our events is on our website, douglasandcork.com. And again, thanks so much to our panelists, to our moderator, and to all of you who've been watching and sending in your excellent questions. We hope you'll see us again, and we hope we'll see you again.